being as this is not just a concert, but also a workshop, meaning that we're going to talk a little bit about the instruments, their history, a bit about the bardic culture, and maybe just a wee bit about how they're played. The harp, as you may know, is really a very ancient instrument. And it finds its way into every culture around the world. And when we think of the harp of antiquity, the earliest image we have of it is King David from the Bible. And that's a good long time ago. But in Ireland, the harp was really quite an important instrument. We know at least as far back as 2,000 years. And the bardic tradition was one that survived really kind of up until recent times, when about 300 years ago, during the time of O'Carolan, everything was shifting dramatically, culturally, politically. And the bardic tradition, which I would say lives to this present day, was transformed in different ways and manifests in different ways. But basically what it consists of is music, storytelling, and poetry. And what the bards were chiefly responsible for was, for one, keeping the history of the people alive and the culture. They also told tales from mythology that were instructional tales. In other words, there was different layers of meaning hidden within these stories. And then they wrote poetry, largely for their patrons, which in some cases were kings, and so they better be pretty good poets, and they better extol the virtues of said king and queen. And but later on, this also translated into a system of patronage through nobles, and people like O'Carolan, who's one of the last great bards, Turlough O'Carolan, would travel from manor home to manor home. I imagine some might have been a little something like the Hampton Mansion, because in fact, when this place was built, was not too long after the death of O'Carolan. And I imagine, I'm not sure exactly when Hampton was built. I know that Eliza Ridgely, who we'll talk about a little later because her harp is in the mansion, was born in 1803. Now, Carolan died in 1736, so good ways before, but you realize that the histories are not so far apart. So he wandered from home to home, playing and composing music in honor of his many patrons. And further back, and even in his time, if a patron didn't take good care of the bard, the harper, instead of getting poetry extolling their virtues, they would get a satire, tearing them down. So you have to be careful not to offend the bard, up until recent times, really. But anyway, what I'd like to play for you is a piece on the small harp, and because, well, first of all, the harp itself. One thing that's interesting about the bardic tradition, I'll try not to talk too long about all this, is the concept of the bardic triads. Now the triads were another form of instruction, the way of teaching the bards, and the bards in turn teaching the people about everything to do with life and culture and the mysteries and the whole works. And they were all broken down into triads, into threes, in verse form. And in this way they could memorize them. And they could memorize hours and hours and hours worth of stories, poetry. And what to me, just thinking about that, is that the number 3 figures very prominently in music. And the number 3 figures prominently in the harp itself. The very form of the harp is made up of 3 parts. The harmonic curve, the sound box, which is where all the tone comes from, and that's hollow inside. If you look in the back, strings are put in through the back, and that's what produces the tone. And the pillar, which provides the strength and support between the harmonic curve. So the harmonic curve is what determines the length of every string and the pitch that it will vibrate best at, and the scale, and so forth. Box, as I said, produces the tone, and the pillar the strength. Now when we think about music itself, it really has 3 elements, doesn't it? It has melody, harmony, and rhythm. And those things, we can even extrapolate that further if we think about, you know, the qualities of a human being. We talk about thinking, feeling, and willing. And I think about those 3 elements being tied up with melody, harmony, and rhythm. And those 3 elements tied up into everything to do with music and the bardic triads And without waxing too philosophical, I will now show you the smaller harp, which is about the size it would have been around the time of King Brian Boru. And in fact, the harp that was known as the Brian Boru harp is still on display at Trinity College in Dublin. And it's only a little bit bigger than this. And in fact, it was the model for my design, what I call the Oladian harp. It has the same essential form. And it's the archetypal form that you see on the Irish emblems, the flags, the coins, and the good old Guinness brew bottle here. The harp figures in every way you can imagine, and in every aspect of life, the music of the harp was of tantamount importance. So if Brian Boru played a harp like this, and he was a known harper, composer, as well as King of Ireland, who united all the tribes of Ireland against the invading Norsemen, who gave the Irish a very hard time for about 200 years, from 800 to 1000. And so we're talking about 1,000 years ago. What I'm going to do is play for you a medley of pieces, starting with some tunes from Carolyn. But these were not written for patrons, they were written for a certain Bridget Cruz. He was also known to write pieces for friends and just pieces about his experiences on the road. So there's some jovial pieces, there are some very sad pieces, and then there are the laments. Which brings me to one other very important aspect of the threes that we encounter. In the bardic tradition, the master harper was master of the three mystical moods of music. There was the music of laughter, sorrow, and repose. And the truly masterful harper, it was said they could play any one of these three forms, and no one could listen without laughing, or crying, or falling asleep. And so was the duty, one of the many duties of the harper, to play for the king and queen at night and help to take their minds off the affairs of state, so forth. But it went much deeper than that also. But in this case, so Carolyn composed these tunes for Bridget Cruz, who was to remain throughout his life in unrequited love. So there you have the element of sadness. And one thing I'll say too is that when we hear the harp and we think of harp music today, we think of this kind of sound, with either gut or nylon strings. And if we were to listen to the harp of ancient times, we'd hear a very different sound, because they were strung with wire, with different forms, sometimes brass, bronze, even silver and gold. And so they had very different quality of tone to them. It's really haunting bell-like sound and a different technique of playing. They used fingernails instead of the fingertips like we do today. And I'm a bit of a hybrid there, because I use the fingernails of my right hand and the tips of my left. That wasn't because I wanted to play both kinds of harps, which in the beginning I did, and loved playing both kinds. Now primarily I play the nylon strung harp. Nylon's the modern day substitute for gut, because it blends so beautifully with the wire strings of the hammer dulcimer. So that's kind of become our signature sound as magical strings. But both harps, gut and wire, were used way back into ancient times, but the Irish were known, Irish and Scottish, for the wire strung harp, very specifically. So you would have heard a more ringing tone. The reason I used the nails is because I was a guitarist for 15 years before I took up the harp. And I just didn't want to get rid of those nails in the right hand. And what it turned out to do was create a little extra brightness out of my melody and a little softer sound out of my left hand. So here's a medley of airs to Bridget Cruz, and just one thing of historical note as you listen to these is that the first two are purely pentatonic. Now there the number 5 comes in. We could talk about numbers forever, of course. But the pentatonic scale goes back to very ancient times. The Chinese music was primarily pentatonic. The early Celtic music was pentatonic. And you'll hear that in the first 2 pieces. And then you'll hear the diatonicism coming into it on the 3rd piece. And then I'm going to go into a medley of jigs. So I'm going to kind of cross a time span. Well, Carolyn himself would have been trained in the very ancient music of Ireland. And he would have known the old music, which probably some of it would sound strange to our modern ears. And, but then he was also very inspired, and he was innovative at the same time, by the music that was coming out of Europe at the time, and particularly the Italian composers. So you hear all these elements figuring into Carolyn's compositions. Bridget Cruz airs.